This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
There are lots of common questions that people have about the Bible, and many of these have to do with locations and events. Henry Smith is here with me, and ABR gets a ton of these questions like, hey, has this thing been found? Has that thing been found? And where is this? And did this really happen? Is there evidence for this? So thought we might just kind of go through some just general, frequently asked questions about archaeology. Maybe we'll start in the Old Testament, starting in Genesis.
Yeah.
And maybe, obviously you're not an expert on all of these things. You might have something to say on some of them and others not. And we'll just kind of work through some of these frequently asked questions. What do you think is one of the more common, what's the most common question that you get or have seen throughout your career or your ministry? Like, is there a burning question that people always seem to ask?
There's topics that are popular. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think something that fascinates people is, who are the Nephilim?
Yeah.
Like if you had one question that people want to ask, everybody is intrigued about who the Nephilim are in Genesis 6.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so everybody loves that. It seems to me everybody loves that subject. You go on Facebook, you go on like a Bible page or an archaeology page, people have got something to say about that.
Yeah.
So that would be one to start with, and we can work our way through other stuff.
So
too.
what does the Bible say about the Nephilim in Genesis 6?
Yeah, so now maybe the way to frame it would be, so we have the Nephilim are with the daughters of men. Okay, and that means they're with them. So who are these Nephilim? Like, so there's been like traditional interpretations of it. So
I don't have the verse from it. Doesn't it say like the sons of God slept with the daughters of men and that produced the Nephilim? Am I remember that right? I'm going to look it up just.
Yeah. Let's read it and then we'll go from there.
So this is Genesis 6:4. This is way after the fall and all that kinds of stuff. But it says, the Nephilim, describing how bad the world was at the time before the flood. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown.
Yeah. So the old view, as I understand it, is that this is like an interbreeding between supernatural beings and human females.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
That's what it sounds like on the surface as you're reading the text. And particularly that phrase, the sons of God, usually is angelic beings of some kind of supernatural beings. And that view goes back, you read things like intertestamental literature, like in the book of First Enoch and that kind of thing. So it's really an older interpretation. So let's pause there for a second though. But one of the objections already, like in my own mind, even thinking about this is, part of me that struggles with that view, at least on the surface, and again, we're making inferences, is how does that work biologically?
Yeah.
How do you produce offspring? You have to have, so you have the human female, you have the egg. How does implantation occur? I know that's a scientific question, but it's still a very practical question.
A practical biological question.
A practical biological question. So how does that work? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but clearly people believe this very early, and this was the traditional view. Now, another view that developed much later, as far as I understand it, is that these are the sons of Cain.
Huh.
So these are human, but they're kind of like it's a euphemism for wicked men.
Okay.
That sort of thing that produce these offspring, and so they're human. They're human offspring.
Okay.
If I had to pick a view, I would probably pick the first one.
Mm-hmm.
But just the whole conversation is really fascinating to people. Think about the implications of that.
Yeah.
Because in the old view, the situation has become so monstrous before the flood.
There's literally monsters.
Yeah, there's like literally this kind of demonic activity that's taking place, and then you have these half-breed offspring. Like, it sounds so strange. It almost can't be real.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So I struggle with it. I think a lot of other people struggle with that aspect of it too.
I think that's why they like to talk about it.
Well, yeah. Who were they?
Yeah.
Right. And what does the text say there? Did you at least reading that? that English version, and afterwards. Is that what it says?
It says the Nephilim were there on the earth in those days and also afterward.
Yeah. So what is afterward?
Yeah.
Now, I haven't looked at that closely. Is that after the flood? Does that imply that they survived the deluge? Or does it just mean sort of in that subsequent history? Is this in other words, is this not exactly chronological? In other words, because Genesis 5 leads you up to the life of Noah, and 532 indicates he's 500 years old, and then after that he has his 3 sons. Is this a literary flashback which is talking about something that's been taking place already long before Noah was 500 years old? So does the afterwards just mean afterwards, but not after the flood?
Afterwards before the flood, but not afterwards after the flood.
After the flood, right? So I that referent has to be sorted out. What does that mean? Are these people that carried over? They're not on the ark.
Yeah.
As far as the narrative goes. So how is that? And then we have the confusing introduction of the Nephilim in the spies report in the book of Numbers.
When the Jews went out to spy out the land of Canaan when they were still in the wilderness, and they brought back a report of what they saw.
Yes.
They saw Nephilim. And so, what is that?
Yeah, so there was men in the land of great stature, the Anakim, right?
In the land of flowing milk and honey.
We were like grasshoppers to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So large cities that fits also with the Canaanite fortifications during that time. So it fits the historical context. So what's going on there in this report? Some texts it'll say like a bad report. But I kind of think it's an evil report because you kind of see what flows after that. They try to kill Caleb and Joshua because Caleb and Joshua is like, no, we'll eat them like bread. So they have a view of faith. No, the Lord has given this land. We're going to go in there and we're going to deal with these people, and there's nothing for us to be afraid of. But the spies are giving this counter view. So did they really see Nephilim? You know what I mean? Like, are they giants?
Is it a figurative? If they felt like grasshoppers, well, obviously they weren't literal grasshoppers. We're like grasshoppers. They were like these huge men of power.
Yeah.
That we felt like nothing to them in their giant cities with walls and,
Yeah, so giant cities implies giant stature.
As an exaggeration of what?
Possibly, because what's the idea? The idea is we don't want to go. We don't want to go in.
Yeah.
We're scared. So, and the report is an evil report. That's actually what the Hebrew text says. I think it's more intense than just a bad report or a negative report. It has an evil intention behind it. So I've often wondered, is the Nephilim reference a deliberate exaggeration on the part of the spies to try to convince the Israelites not to go into the land? We can't conquer this place, So that is all very interesting because did they really see Nephilim? Because that really would change the whole understanding of who the Nephilim are.
Yeah.
Or is it an exaggeration and there are no Nephilim in that time period? It's only before the flood in this unique set of circumstances, which was part of the monstrous kind of nature of what was happening before the flood. And that's why one of the reasons why God destroyed the whole world.
Yeah.
So where did we leave this? Well, with a bunch of unanswered questions. That's kind of like this episode is, right?
Yeah.
But things that people are really interested in. And I think it's good to say at ABR, we try to look for answers for people, but there's some things that we don't know all the answers.
Yeah.
So,
I got one more question while we're talking about giants. Well, so now if Goliath was a giant, now I know there's the Nephilim, and I've also read about the Anakim.
Yeah.
Are those similar? Is the Anakim just more giants? And if Goliath was a giant, like if he was a part of the Anakim, like that kind of seems like there's giant people.
Yeah.
Like, is that why people think like, is there a connection there?
I think there's I think people make a cognitive connection. So the Anakim, are they men of stature? Does that mean they're tall? That's the question that I think we should ask of the text. Or are they maybe they're a little bit taller, or they're maybe bigger men, but of stature, meaning power, that
Skilled
kind of
warriors,
thing,
maybe.
great, does it literally mean that they're giants? And some of this, I think, comes out of, if I remember right, in some of the Latin translation, some of it's translated as gigantus.
Okay.
So, and the Latin Bible proliferated in the West after Jerome's translation. So did that sow the seeds in minds of people? Oh, these are giants. And then we start thinking giants like, what do you think of when you think of a giant? To your question, you think of Goliath.
Yeah.
So, and in all the traditional translations, Goliath is 9'9". So your brain, as a Christian, you know that scripture is coherent all throughout.
Mm-hmm.
So what does your mind kind of do? It starts to draw the connections. So Goliath is 9'9". We have the Anakim, the Gigantus. We have the Nephilim before the flood in this monstrous situation. And you kind of like
link it all together.
You link it all together in your mind because it seems to make sense. So an interesting point of discussion is about Goliath's height because...
Oh, controversy alert.
Yeah.
If the Nephilim weren't already controversial.
Yeah. Well, see, I'm not being very dogmatic about that, right?
Okay,
So I'm kind of wussing out here a little bit.
Yeah.
But now, see, the Goliath question is in the Hebrew text that we use for our English translations. He's 6 cubits. 6 cubits and change tall. So when you convert that to feet, he's like 9'9".
Okay.
But in the Greek text, he's 4 cubits.
Okay.
Which would make him 6'7", 6'8", somewhere in that range.
I think isn't it also in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, that's the thing. So the question has been asked: is the Masoretic a mistake, an accident? Was it deliberately inflated, or is it original? And then somebody doing the Greek translation read it and said, "This is too big. Nobody can be that tall. So we'll change the number
to make it." More
those
realistic.
are possibilities, right?
Okay.
Those are because scribes are thinking about the text as they're copying it. Sometimes they're supposed to just copy it, but sometimes they're thinking about what they're writing and they think, well, that can't be right.
Yeah.
So those are the different views that are out there. But until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which preserves portions of the text and has 4 cubits as the height of Goliath. So now we have a Hebrew text from 2,000 years ago, 4 cubits. So that would make Goliath 6'7", 6'8", somewhere like that. And we have an independent text, the Septuagint text, which says the same thing.
Wow.
So, but in our minds, right, we think giant, 9'9", he's extraordinarily big.
That's definitely what it looked like on the flannel graph.
Right?
Yeah.
It looks like that. My family went to see a play about David.
Mm-hmm.
It's escaping me.
Sights and Sounds?
Sight and Sound.
In Lancaster County.
Yeah, in Lancaster County. It's absolutely phenomenal. And they tried it out, Goliath and his brothers, and they did this depiction where they were gigantic, or like 20 feet tall.
Wow.
Obviously, even exaggerating the Hebrew text, but
Yeah.
just for the poetic
For the
sake
visual,
of it.
yeah.
Yeah, for the visual effect of what the Israelites were facing. And there was a lot of truth to it. But even a man of 6'7", 6'8", you think of like, if you're a football fan, you think of somebody who plays left tackle, 6'8", 300 pounds. That's a formidable human being. To me, that's a
giant.
A giant.
Yeah.
That's a big man.
Yeah.
And then you have this little shepherd boy who comes out to meet him in battle. So he doesn't have to be 9'9". In terms of the way we think about it, it doesn't take away from the story.
No.
Or the account. And we want to be true to what the text says. So like in my view, I think the evidence leans better towards that Goliath was 6'8", 6'9", something around there, which would still be very large, a giant man, not a giant 9'9". The other part of it is, think about somebody who's 9'9". There was a guy, I don't know, 100 years ago who was like 8'11".
Yeah, tallest man in the world.
Tallest man in the world. And when you see video footage of him walking, I mean, he's like a guy on stilts.
Yeah. He looks like just a board. He's so skinny.
Yeah. And so you think about just the practical aspect of the human frame being that tall. Does that really give you an advantage on the battlefield?
Yeah.
Imagine a man who's a left tackle. Again, plays for the Cowboys. He's a left tackle, right? He's big, he's strong. He can carry the suit of armor and the sword. He's got this big voice and he's cursing out Yahweh and the people of Israel. But a guy 9'9", it just seems, again, these are inferences though.
Yeah.
So, these aren't in the text, but inferences from the text. Just seems to me, we think in our mind, oh, he's 10 feet tall. That gives him this enormous advantage on the battlefield. Does it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
How mobile was he?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So the point of your question on Goliath was just simply the way that we cognitively connect dots. And there's nothing wrong with that. We do that as Christians, and we should do that because we know that the biblical text is coherent all through. But I wonder if assigning the name giant to Goliath, thinking he's 9'9", backwards informs the way we think about the Anakim, the way we think about the Gigantus, the way we think about the Nephilim, and then the Nephilim before the flood. Is that kind of poisoning the well backwards? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I've kind of wrestled through it. So I'm not giving a straight answer for Nephilim because I don't have a firm view on that.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting, right? And people love this subject.
Yeah. And
People
I guess
love it.
one more thing, because I know I've seen on the internet the bodies they've found of giants, of the Nephilim.
We call that tabloid archaeology, Luke.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that stuff is,
I have to give credit to our former colleague, Gordon Franz. He wrote an article about 15 years ago called that tabloid archaeology. It's a great name. We've talked a little bit in a previous podcast about being careful about sensational claims out on the internet. One of the things that ABR does is helps people, warns them, hey, don't pass this stuff on to your friends. Don't pass it on to your atheist friends who you're trying to convince that the Bible's accurate. Yeah, those pictures of the giants are fraudulent, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. Nobody has found enormously large skeletons, to our knowledge, in the Holy Land that would seem to fit the idea that the Anakim were these enormously large-sized men. As a general statement, I think people that lived at that time period, say the time of David, from the skeletons that have been found, of a somewhat smaller stature than Western people living in America. So a man who was 6'8" would be a giant.
Yeah.
Was David 5'4", 5'3", 5'5", maybe? I don't know. I'm guessing. We don't know his height exactly, but to a shepherd boy. Yeah,
well, you just think of humans in history, or at least, European humans and maybe some other cultures. Like if you ever have walked in the door of a house that was built in, the 1600s or 1500s, like you have to stoop down because their height was on average.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if throughout human history, if until, I don't know, modern nutrition or availability of things that didn't impede human growth, and so they kind of reached more of their normal potential, and I'm sure genetics are a part of it too, but if the average person in, the Middle East was, 5'5", I mean, what's the average height of someone in Asia right now, in Japan? Like they're all kind of a similar thing. So
the rare person who grows to a large height.
Yeah.
Right. And like 1 in a billion people grow up large enough to play professional basketball.
Yeah.
But that's the rare exception, right? So, that's a good point. Different societies, it's genetics, it's nutrition, it's environment, it's historical circumstances, all that. I would imagine maybe people do have the ability to grow more, but again, only to a certain point, and then the nutritional aspect of it would have an effect. Think of a small child today, maybe who has a sickness or something. Whose nutrition is not that would stunt their growth. We would say that, right? But that's because of maybe they have some kind of situation going on. So Well,
so interesting stuff. Yeah, I've always wondered about the Nephilim. I mean, I haven't seen the whole movie, I watched part of it. But if you watch that Noah's Ark movie with Russell Crowe, they depict the Nephilim as rock monsters, basically stars that have literally fallen from the sky, and they melted them, and it turned into mud around them, and they tried to walk, and so they look like it's solidified, and so they became these rocks.
Yeah,
and it looks. I thought that was an interesting portrayal of this thing that we don't know about. Not that I think that movie is accurate or whatever. I haven't actually watched the whole thing, but I think there's some other issues with it. But it's something that we don't know about. It was pre-flood, or at least in Genesis.
Right, Genesis 6.
It's hard to know what that world was like, other than these few verses that we have.
Last thing I'll add to it is I do have a friend who's been on our TV show, Tim Chafee, works for Answers in Genesis. He did his THM dissertation on this. And wants to publish a book, which I'm itching to read. Maybe we get him on as a guest someday. Now, he's convinced of the fallen angel view. That's the view that he came through after extensively studying it. Now, I don't like to default to arguments from authority, but you can't study everything thoroughly. So when it's somebody that you trust, you kind of say, oh, well, if he came down in that direction, that's worth looking into at the very least. So that's something that, is worth considering. Again, the sons of God thing, I've talked to him about that, and when that term is used, it refers to angelic beings. Mm-hmm. It doesn't refer to men.
Yeah.
Generally in the Old Testament. So, so why is there an exception in this case?
Yeah.
And if you can show that exegetically by studying the text, that's fine. So, intriguing. You ask, what is the subject out there that people ask about the most? That people talk about.
Yeah.
I think that's right near the top of the list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another one that I know I see around out there and people ask and are trying to find, and I don't know if there's people claim think they know where it was, is where was the Garden of Eden?
Yeah.
And so what do you think about that? I don't think it's been found, but
Yeah. Now, see, I've just recently saw on Facebook, I'm like on a couple of archaeology groups, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But people introduce subjects that are sort of not related, but kind of related because they're excited. Mm-hmm. You know how that is. And, somebody put up a map proposing where they think the Garden of Eden was. So the reason for trying to identify it, in the region of like Iraq or Mesopotamia or something is because of the mention of the rivers.
Yeah.
You have in the Genesis text, Genesis 2, you have the Tigris and the Euphrates River that are mentioned. So immediately you go, well, we have the Tigris and Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. So,
it must be there.
Yeah. But then, you have the Pishon River. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold, is what the text says. Well, we have no idea where that is. Mm-hmm. So,
and then there's another one here. The name of the second river is the Gihon. Like, is that like the Gihon Spring? Like, that's in Israel, right?
Well, the Gihon Spring is in Israel. That's a good question. I don't know where that name comes from. That would be an interesting study. What's tracing the etymology of that name? Why is the Gihon Spring named that? And then can you trace it back? Is the source of that perhaps the Genesis text? Yeah. Where the name comes from? So the question really is, where is the Garden of Eden? Well, that will depend on your view of the scope of and destructive force of the flood.
Yeah.
So that's really what the crux of the matter comes down to. So people who are debating this, if you believe that the flood was regional or local, then you would think, well, the world hasn't been completely reshaped, and therefore we might be able to find evidence of where the garden was. Perhaps the other two rivers don't exist anymore, so maybe you could find evidence of their previous existence, where it would carve out valleys and so forth. Mm-hmm. But if you take the view that the flood destroyed the whole world, stripped down the geology and then relaid down the geology, and then if you add to that the general view amongst creationists that the continents also split up during the flood. Mm-hmm. Now, some don't follow that view, but that's the general view. That's kind of where I lean. Mm-hmm. In either case, we have to explain the continents have split apart. Yeah. It's clear, you can see South America and Africa fit together perfectly. So we know that the continents split apart. The question is, when did they split apart? Yeah. In some kind of post-flood thing or during the flood? The point of that is, if the flood is global and that destructive, and we have continental separation, the Garden of Eden's been wiped out.
Yeah. One question I always had is like, well, we know where. Yeah, it goes back to the flood thing. Yeah, we know where the Tigris and the Euphrates are now, but pre-flood, that just could have been. How did they come up with those names? Like, are those the same rivers? Are those symbolic rivers?
Yeah.
Because I would assuming a worldwide flood, everything has been destroyed, nothing looks the same. Are they just attributing these names to these places just to, like, I don't know enough about what these names actually mean.
Yeah.
If there's something else in the naming of it. Because it says like the garden was in the east in Eden.
Right.
Like, well, where was that region?
East of what?
East of what?
Yeah.
And what does I've heard listened on some other podcasts where they wonder if, when talking in the Old Testament, especially the Torah, when you're talking about something, they went off into the east, or they were sent to the east, this happened to the east. Like the east may even be more of a poetic way of saying something. Like it's less about a geographic direction as it is a symbolic something else.
Perhaps a casting away from the good, because I'm speculating here when I say that.
Yeah.
Because when Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden to the east, they're what? Out of the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
That is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So to go east is a bad thing, right? So if you want to put it in a pagan context, to be pushed away from that which is good, God in this case, right? So, and from what I understand, ancient temples were built with the entrance in the east, because you're re-entering the presence of God from the east. So that's interesting. Now, a lot of people think that's just a mythical motif, but from a biblical standpoint, it would seem to me that comes from an actual historical reality.
Yeah.
To be cast east is to be out of the presence of God, the goodness of God, to be cast out of to be in exile, right? So, now the general view of those who would hold to the global flood, who think that the Garden of Eden was wiped out, which is the view that I would lean towards, it just makes sense to me, is that the names were carried over for some reason. Yeah. Just like,
to pay homage to
New York. York was in England. We have New York in the New World.
Yeah.
Right. New Jersey, and on, that kind of just very basic, simple thing.
Yeah.
But that would imply that Noah and his sons knew these names from Genesis 2 enough to bring those words, those names, those designations over into the new world.
Yeah.
And then they would be passed on through whatever language they were using. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Also, if you think about, the Tigris and the Euphrates is considered the Fertile Crescent.
Yes,
right?
That's
and
right.
So it's
that's
like,
right.
well, what, and I don't know what it looked like post-flood immediately, but what if that land, we think of it as desert now, but what if it was this paradise?
It looked more fertile. Perhaps it reminded them of the idea of
a garden.
That's a possibility. We know that this is where people settled very early after the flood, after the world was repopulated. The explosion of civilization takes place there. The Sumerians have one of the earliest cultures. What is that? That's in southern Mesopotamia, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the other interesting thing, right? Like, it gets the name Tigris and Euphrates River, and we have this very early settlement in the post-flood period. This is the plain of Shinar. Genesis 10, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel incident, right? So I think it's really fascinating. The interconnections, the names being remembered, being brought over. It would have to come through Noah and his sons. Did they have knowledge of this biblical text? That's another interesting
Or when they're
question.
passing down their genealogy of like, hey, grandfather his name was this, he lived this long. Hey, have you ever heard the story of how God created the world? Like, I imagine they were very aware of the creator, and obviously Noah did, but he would have passed these stories down. This is where we came from. This is how the world is created. Yeah.
There's a certain logic to that. We obviously can't prove it, right?
Yeah.
It's not in the biblical text per se.
No.
So we're drawing inferences. And so we have to be careful. We should not be dogmatic, but there is a certain logic to it. And it does tie to a bigger issue, right? So in these early texts with flood stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, goes all the way back to like the 3rd millennium.
Okay,
that's a flood story. The hero of the story is Utnapishtim, right? And then you have the Genesis text, which Moses pens later. So now the traditional critical view is, the Israelites just borrowed that stuff from ancient myths and then made their own myth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you take the biblical text as we do, historical, revelation, how do you explain the similarities in these early flood accounts, early creation accounts? You have to account for that in some kind of way. I think the simplest way to account for it is what you just mentioned, coming down through Noah and his 3 sons into the new world. That perhaps God gave Noah that revelation because he's the only prophet. The whole world is being destroyed, right? So how do we even have any knowledge? okay, let me back up. It's certainly possible that God gave this revelation directly to Moses on Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Totally. And the text says that he was up on the mountain for days on end with God. I don't deny that possibility. But that doesn't explain the early literature that has the similarities with the Genesis text.
Yeah.
So how do you explain that? I think the best way to explain that is through Noah. Somehow the Lord gave him the revelation. Now, whether it was written down or remembered through oral tradition, we don't know. But there's enough there of the similarities that any model has to explain that.
Yeah.
Right? So now the skeptics don't believe any of that, but we have to have a model that explains the data. And so I think that points us in a direction that might be helpful, which is analogous to our discussion about the names of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Mm-hmm. How did that get passed down? Well, the only way it could have come is through the 8 people who were on the ark.
Yeah.
It's the only logical explanation, unless you want to revert to a local or regional flood.
Yeah.
Which I don't think the text allows for.
Yeah.
So
I've always, and I'm not a scholar and haven't studied, but I've always made the assumption that the stories of how the world is created was passed down from father to son, and even how long they lived in the pre-flood time.
Yeah.
I mean, it probably, like, I'd have to look on a thing, but like, you know, Adam lived to be 930 and
right, 930.
And it's like you could have, like, Noah could have talked to his great grandfather, and it's like, were you around there? Well, Adam was. He was my grandfather, and I talked to him. He told me this is how it happened. Like,
yeah,
it's plausible that way. But I just assume that these stories were told father and son. This is how it happened. Here's my grandfather's. Here's my totem. If we use it from another culture, here's where we came from. Here's where they all were. And then, yeah, when Moses wrote it all down, it was formally knowledge from God given to him. Also,
correct. Yeah.
So he may have known it, but maybe God dictated some more details. We're kind of wondering about these things. But
but again, I think it's great because we still have to come up with some model to try to explain it, even though we're never going to have direct proof of it. We're just, unless we find some tablet or some kind of archive of something that we don't know about that gives us more direct evidence. So, but what you're suggesting is what we're suggesting makes sense to me, but only in the context of the revelation itself. So you're assuming the accuracy of the lifespans and the continuity of the facts being passed down, right? That's sort of baked into the paradigm.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I think you're right in assuming that Adam actually did live to be that old, and they had these overlapping generations and multiple generations that could tell the story and pass it on, or maybe they wrote it down. We don't know. So it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
Now the skeptic would also say, you couldn't have written it down because writing was only invented at this period of time, which is half accurate. We see writing appear in the archaeological record at a certain point in time, and we don't have it before that. But that doesn't mean they didn't write before the flood.
Yeah.
We don't have anything from before the flood because the whole world was destroyed. Yeah. So anyway.
No,
hope we didn't run too far afield with that.
Oh no, I haven't. It's really interesting. I was, I want to circle back to something you were talking about in a minute about the plain of Shinar with Babel and stuff like that. But you just brought up something about, well, they didn't have these things before the flood, but in pre-flood in Genesis, when it's talking about the descendants of Cain, it talks about how a few generations after that, one of Cain's was named, I'm looking it up right now, Jubal. He was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. I mean, that's where the word Jubilee comes from, music, that kind of stuff. And then Tubal-Cain, who forged all things tools out of bronze and iron. So, I mean, we believe the text, obviously, but that we assume that there was no technology pre-flood, or some people may, but like,
or at least from that early period, that seems to imply technology. That's what that's giving you a snapshot into.
Yeah. So obviously the world started over after Noah, but before then they they would have had thousands of years to also, they weren't doing anything to, like, they weren't just picking fruit off trees and, living their lives. Like they probably built structures and all.
Sure. Think about the planning, the architecture, and the labor required to build the ark.
Yeah.
Unless God gives it to Noah and he can keep it in his memory and give instructions, you would imagine that the innovative aspects of the ark construction that are not in the text, that Shem, Ham, and Japheth could have used, and Noah could have used their own innovations to come up with getting rid of waste, collecting rainwater, all that kind of stuff, right? You would have written plans, it seems to me, to build a structure like that.
Yeah.
Like God gave them the outline. It's very particular in the text, but it doesn't tell us everything about exactly how it was built. So that always has implied to me, writing, I don't see how you could build a structure like that without being able to literally write architectural plans.
Yeah, draw something up on the back of a skin of something, and
and we don't know. We don't know. Maybe they've had paper. That sounds like outside the box thinking. Wait a minute, paper wasn't invented until da da da. But as Peter says, this is a whole civilization that developed, rebelled against God, and was completely destroyed. And in the same way, when Jesus returns, the same kind of thing. We're going to have a whole civilization that will develop and rebel against God and be destroyed by a mighty act of judgment. They're written in parallel. So who knows?
Yeah.
I'm not saying computers and airplanes, but the text gives you just enough for your imagination to have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, and that more questions. I mean, these are common questions.
Yes.
People wrestle with these questions, they debate. And
now, see, when you have questions, you're supposed to give answers. But in this case, we're having more fun with it because
we're just speculating.
We're bringing up more questions.
Yeah. You mentioned talking about the plain of Shinar, however it's, and the Tower of Babel. So that seems like that would have been a major post-flood archaeological structure, or a major structure. In theory, probably could be a part of the archaeological record if it was the largest thing at that time, or trying to assemble up to heaven. Has that been found? Babel, it makes me think of Babylon.
Yeah.
Like, is that where people think it is? What do you?
Yeah, that's another, that's a great one. Another one that I kind of lean in a direction, but there's several alternative ideas out there. So the first one is, it would seem that Babel and Babylon would be connected with one another. That would be a natural.
In English, certainly.
Yeah. Now, whether that's not the case or the case or not in Hebrew, our friend Doug Petrovich, who's an archaeologist and has been on our TV show and written for our ministry, and he has a couple of books, has done some work on this, and he doesn't see it being at Babel. He says that the etymological connection is superficial. He thinks it was at Eridu, which is a city in the further south in Mesopotamia. So way down south in modern day Iraq. Okay. So you're down, close to the Persian Gulf, where some of the early cities are found. So he's got a video online where he outlines the excavations that were done there, this gigantic platform that was found with multiple levels that seems to have been suddenly abandoned. At least that's his interpretation of it. And so his view, which is intriguing to me, is that that this gigantic platform that seems to have been abandoned was the Babel construction, the tower construction, and it was never finished. That's his take
theory
on it. So that's worth considering, I think. The other thing he says, I think that the water table's too high at Babylon. That's another. I think that's kind of one of his multiple arguments that he makes, that Babylon proper is not the right location. Now, I'm not dogmatic about that, but I find that very intriguing. I think that's worth pursuing and looking at further. So the question is also not only the location, but the historicity of the event. This is another event that is recorded in the early portions of Genesis, at least before Abraham, that, our secular friends obviously don't believe. And as the church, it's pretty clear what the text is telling us about the origin of languages. And so that's a fascinating study in and of itself, right? So it not only connects with archaeology, it's history, and then it's the whole thing of the proliferation of languages and language groups.
Yeah.
Like some languages, a lot of languages are related, but then there's other languages that are completely unrelated with one another.
Yeah.
How do the language families relate? How do they develop?
Yeah.
Right.
Chinese is nothing like German.
You could say that again.
Or Swahili is nothing like.
Yeah.
And I know there in Africa there's the Bantu languages, and then there's in regions but they all come from a singular.
Yeah, or even in that region, going back to the biblical, right? Your point is good. You have the Sumerian language, which in writing is a pictorial language.
Okay.
One of the first ones parallels Egypt,
okay,
essentially in terms of time. But right to the east of that, up against the Zagros Mountains, which is in Iran, modern-day Iran, you have the Elamites, who are mentioned early. The sons of Shem? I can't remember. Genesis 10. But right next to the Sumerians, you've got a completely different language of a different order, different language family.
Wow.
So but they're neighbors.
Yeah.
You would think that there would be similarities with neighbors. And Semitic languages, that lead, like Sumerian leads to Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, which leads to Hebrew and Aramaic and Canaanite and Phoenician, and all those are interrelated. And then right next to Samaria, you have Elamite, which is completely different. That to me would point to the Babel incident, where you have not related language amongst people that are near each other. And what would that cause? That would cause lack of communication, paranoia, distrust, which is a manifestation of God's judgment, right? The people refuse to follow his instructions, and the consequence is a negative one for humanity. Not that languages in and of themselves are a bad thing, but think about how misunderstandings are with language. I mean, my wife is Dominican, and she speaks fluent English. But we've discovered over 21 years that, there's miscommunications in the way that our language is used, because my primary language is English.
Yeah.
And hers is still ultimately Spanish.
Yeah.
And so the nuances of language and the misunderstandings, and then, getting into a tussle about this or that because we didn't communicate, and it turned out it was certain words that were used that I misunderstood, because in English, my brain is thinking this way and her brain is thinking a different way. And I'm just using that as an example, but think about societies so you got the Elamites living right next to the Sumerians, different language group. Fascinating. What do you do with that? How do you explain that from an evolutionary standpoint? That they've got to come up with an explanation. Seems to me that this may point in the direction of the Babel incident.
Wow.
So
I didn't know anything about that. I haven't even thought about the language dispersing.
And there was a recent report about trying to decipher the Elamite language. I think we have it on our website. Can't remember the details of it, but so the whole question of language comes into this, because that's a different field of study.
Yeah.
But it's related.
Yeah.
And it's complicated because all the material in Genesis 1-11 is universal. It applies to humanity universally. Then in Genesis 12, things are narrowed down to working salvation through one man and one nation and one people group, essentially, which is not universal. It becomes universal in terms of the offer of the gospel, right?
It returns.
It returns to a universal offer of salvation. But all of these early texts are dealing with these universal things. So all this different stuff comes into it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of overwhelming in some ways, because you just can't. I'm saying these things about language generally, but I'm not a language expert.
Yeah. Maybe one last common question that I think people have, and maybe we can end on this one for this session. I know people want to know, hey, so if Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire from heaven, you would think there might, since those were major cities, that there would be evidence of cities that were destroyed by fire and brimstone. And so maybe this is kind of more solid place to end because there may be slightly more evidence to this than some of the other things we're going to talk about today.
Right, right.
Are there any theories out there, or have there been evidence that seems to line up with where Sodom and Gomorrah were? Like, is there a modern equivalent of where, like I know some cities, there's a modern equivalent. Well, it's still called this today, and that's where the old one was. Is there anything like that for Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah, there's I've like just about everything that you study in the Bible. There's disputes about these kind of things, especially when it comes to archaeology. So I'll start with the older view, and that is there's cities that were discovered on the Jordan side of the Dead Sea, on the southern shore of the Dead Sea, essentially southeast shore of the Dead Sea. Particularly two places called Babadra and Numera, which were historically identified early. I think Albright identified them as candidates for Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay.
And then there were excavations done there at those two sites, especially in the 70s. A lot of evidence for destruction. Even things like, it looks like, buildings burned to the ground from the top down.
Oh, wow.
A couple of structures that were found that look like the archaeology seems to point to, like, now that could be an invading army throwing torches on top of a roof or something like that. But it also could imply the fire from the sky, the fire and brimstone literally coming out of the heavens, right? So there seems to be geographic correlations. There seems to be general archaeological correlations. One of the challenges, though, is that traditional dates for the pottery are earlier than Abraham. So that gets into the question of, so this is early Bronze period. Abraham, when you read the biblical text very carefully for Abraham's life, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah occurs between when God gives the final promise in Genesis 17 and 8 in early part of chapter 18, I will return to you this time next year and you will have a son.
Okay.
And Abraham says,
yeah.
How can a man who's 100 years old you have a son? How can a woman who's 90, Sarah's 90? So the way the text flows, that incident happens in between the promise and the birth of Isaac.
Okay.
It's very, very precise. And when you work out the time frame for Abraham's life, depending on a couple of when you take how long the Egyptian sojourn is, which we can't get into, but you put Abraham, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is like 2100 BC, 2000 BC, somewhere around there. But the pottery from Babadra and Numera is earlier. It's like 2400 BC. So critics of that view say, hey, look, the pottery's off. It's earlier. It doesn't fit the biblical chronology. It doesn't fit the patriarchal chronology. And that's a legitimate criticism. You have to come up with an answer for that. Now, some have suggested that some of the dates in this early period are off. They're too old.
Okay.
Because a lot of them are based on carbon-14 dating and not written records.
Oh.
So is there an adjustment that should take place? Because the other evidence seems to fit. That's an open question. And you have to be qualified to be able to examine the pottery and then offer redating. If you're offering redating, you're talking 3 centuries. That's a pretty big task. That's like doctoral kind of work. So my gut tells me that that's the way to go, but somebody needs to do the work. I know one guy who did a proposed redating of the early Bronze period in his dissertation, but nobody else has built anything off of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a disconnect with the dates at Babadra and Numera.
Okay.
Right? So you seem to have geography, you seem to have evidence that might be consistent. Dr. Wood has published articles on our website about this. He thinks it's the right location, that the dates be adjusted, but he hasn't put forth how you go about adjusting the dates. Here's the rationale. Here's the evidence that shows why these dates are off.
Okay.
So that's one major choice.
Okay.
For the location.
So I was looking up a little things beforehand. So is Tel El Hammam, the current dig that's going on there, is that either Babadra or Numeria?
No.
That's a different location.
That's right. Babadra and Numera is the southern side of the Dead Sea in Jordan.
Okay.
Tel Hammam's north of the Dead Sea and east slightly in modern day Jordan.
Okay, so that's another candidate.
That's another candidate.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Steve Collins has been excavating there. I think he's done now because he's wanting to get his stuff published. So he dug for, I think, 17 years, something along those lines.
And didn't Dr. Byers from ABR also?
Yes, he's been one of the main excavators there. It's as far as archaeology goes, it is a absolutely incredible site. I mean, the pottery they find there, the size of it, it was a major, major city in antiquity. So it's a really important site, and it's good that Dr. Collins has been excavating it.
And did they find fire?
Yeah. So now the geographical arguments are not my strong suit. So in my mind, it's still I'm open to the identification of that city as a possible candidate.
Okay.
And I think we should be open to the geographical arguments. Collins makes some arguments, and one of the guys that was on the staff, David Graves, has written a lot about how the geography seems to fit better than the southern location. So I think we need to be open to the geography. The major problem with Collins' identification is that he interprets Abraham's lifespan, which is 175, as a symbolic number.
Oh.
Okay. And the same thing with the rest of the patriarchs. Isaac, 180, Jacob, 147, and even possibly Moses, who lived to be 120. That these are all symbolic formulations.
Numbers. Okay.
That these are honorific numbers. We might know what they mean. We might not know what they mean. We're not sure. That sort of thing. Now, if that were true, and I don't think it is, and I'll explain why in a minute, then you don't have a chronology in the Bible.
Yeah.
For this time period.
You can kind of pick and choose.
And if the Bible doesn't give you a chronology, then now you're looking in the archaeological record for something that correlates. And so it's kind of flexible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the archaeology points here, then, you know. So he has a destruction he claims is around 1600 BC.
Okay.
Give or take. And he believes that's the correlation with the incident, the Sodom and Gomorrah destruction.
Okay.
That's anywhere from 3 to 5 centuries off from the traditional view. So now they claim that they found evidence of melted pottery. How much of that they found is unclear to me. I've heard different things that they haven't found nearly as much as they claim. Pottery can be melted by lightning. So if you have a few pieces of pottery, that doesn't prove that this is the Sodom and Gomorrah incident that caused this melted pottery. You would have to have wide-scale evidence across the site. Now, maybe they have it. But it's not clear to me that they have it. The pottery is much later. But Collins says, look, this view that Genesis yields a chronology, that's out. So if that's out, he's saying that interpretation doesn't work, this interpretation is a better interpretation of the evidence. Okay. So we got that so far. Mm-hmm. Now, I've done a lot of work on the text itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, chronology, that's your thing.
And when you go back and look at the text, you walk through, and I would encourage the listener, open up your English Bible and walk through Abraham's biography. And if you have the time, get a piece of paper, and every time time is mentioned in one way or the other, write it down. And you'll see that there is no way that you can symbolize the numbers in Abraham's life.
There's too many other numbers.
Too many other numbers. You have time intervals as short as 9 months, gestation periods.
Mm-hmm. You
have Sarah being 10 years younger than Abraham. You have a 10-year interval. You have a 13-year interval. You have Isaac's weaning. So from his birth to his weaning, which is 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And you have all these temporal indicators that are in the text. After this time, after his mother's death, after these things, many days. When you put it all together, in other words, you take the whole thing. What Collins does is he takes the lifespan and, be frank, he pulls it out of context and then symbolizes it. And he doesn't deal with the rest of the data carefully enough. Because when you deal with the data carefully, you can't get away from the literalness of what gets you to 175 from Abraham's birth.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a chronological biography. If you walk it out, you can't symbolize the 175.
There's too many place markers.
Right. Too many. There's like I shouldn't say dozens. There's a lot. So I would encourage the viewer or the listener, be like Bereans, check it out for yourself. Mm-hmm. I'm telling you the truth, but don't just trust me. Read the text for yourself. So I don't think you can get there. I don't think you can symbolize those numbers. But I'm open to the geographical argument. So in other words, look for evidence at Tel Hammam, not from the period that you're claiming correlates with the destruction, but look for it from an earlier period that fits the patriarchal chronology. And let's see. In my view, it would be a shame if there was actually evidence for the destruction of Tel Hammam earlier, and you're not looking for it in the right time period.
Okay.
So I think, in my view, let's leave open the possibility that geography is right. Now, some have critiqued the geography. Like Dr. Wood has said, the geography doesn't work.
Okay.
And he has his reasons for that. For me, I'm like, let's leave that question open and explore Baba Dra. Let's go back to Baba Dra and relook at the pottery and see if we can do more work and keep looking at Tel Hammam and compare them both. The thing that I can't follow Dr. Collins with is his treatment of the biblical text. It's just not it's terrible exegesis of the text. And the other part is methodologically treating the archaeology as if it's equal in authority and clarity as the text, because we have this whole thing that's kind of going on with archaeologists in Christian circles. I'm opening up a can of worms here with this, but that the archaeological interpretations somehow are on equal footing with the sacred text. And so, but in my view, it's like the Bible is not just any other ancient book.
Yeah,
it's the word of the Creator, and therefore it has a different evidential value to it than the interpretation of archaeological evidence, which is often talked about as if it's neutral. Like the data says this, the data says that, the data says this. People will often say this. And I always say data doesn't say anything. You say this about the data, which means you're interpreting the data.
Yeah.
Which means you're telling trying to give an account for the data that is being funneled through your mind. So it's not the data says, it's XYZ archaeologist says.
Yeah.
So are we going to say that XYZ archaeologists' utterances are on equal footing with God's utterances? And I think the audience gets the idea, and you get the idea that, to me, the answer is no. The archaeology is a servant to the text. So now, a lot of people don't agree with that, but I think that's the only place that you can go if you're saying that the Bible really is, from God. So that was a very long-winded explanation about Sodom and Gomorrah, but I think both sites should continue to be investigated.
Yeah, it sounds
to see where the evidence leads. I would like to see Collins and somebody else who takes over the dig, if he's done, to look in the earlier period to see if they can find evidence for a destruction that fits the patriarchal chronology. I think that's where the answer lies.
Yeah, it sounds like of all the things we've kind of talked about today, this one seems like, well, it is newer in time, but there does seem to be at least a couple candidates that scientifically, archaeologically, geographically make sense. There's still more work to be done, but are strong candidates that we're not saying either one is right, but there's...
Yeah, I want to be careful. I'm not saying Baba Dra is right.
Okay, yeah.
You know what I mean? But I think we just have to be really careful. We think we know. This is a human thing too. So I'm including myself in this, right? I've been critiquing Dr. Collins a little bit here, his arguments at least. But to be fair to him, we're all susceptible to this. You know what I mean? Like we've dug at a site that we think is Khirbet el-Makadr. We've made a lot of arguments as to why we think it is. I'm pretty convinced at a pretty high percentage that it's Joshua's eye. But it's very possible over the course of time that more archaeological evidence will come to light that would change that thinking, nuance that thinking, or reject that thinking. And we've seen that happen over and over again in the history of archaeology, right?
Yeah.
So what seems so sure to me in this moment, when more information comes to light later, it's not as sure anymore. And so I think archaeologists make a mistake when they're so dogmatic about what they think the evidence is telling us.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to be careful. Whereas, can I add this?
Yeah,
add this
of course.
thought, because this is something I've been thinking about. So when we think about history, we think about because that's what we're getting at here, right? What happened in the past? But actually, what we call it history, but it's really historiography. In the technical sense, we're recording events that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
The history itself is gone. In other words, the event itself is no longer accessible to us.
Yeah.
So we're writing about the event, but we don't have access to the event itself.
Mm-hmm.
But when God gives scripture, God's nature and existence is such that he actually has access to the history. He's the only person that not only gives historiography in the Bible, but in his mind, he has past, present, and future knowledge of the actual events as they happened. So if you took an example, Nathan the prophet confronts David
mm-hmm.
about his sin with Bathsheba and having Uriah murdered, right?
Mm-hmm.
That speech is not only historiography, but the historian, God himself, has recorded that in the sacred text. God was there in that room, omnipresent, for every word that was spoken between Nathan and David. And there's no other historian who can do that. Even if you had a scribe sitting in the room trying to record that conversation, they still would do it fallibly. So what is my point? It sounds like I'm being pedantic about it. So when we talk about the Bible, we not only have a historiography that's true, we have a historian who's given it, who actually has access to the events themselves. Even now. So he could, in theory, bring up a video of Nathan and David's conversation. And no one else can do that.
Yeah.
So that's what makes the Bible unique, and we need to treat it that way. So that's kind of like my shtick on history. I've been thinking about that. Because, I love it. We love history, right? You love history. We've had a lot of conversations about history. And I like other history, too. I watch this guy on the YouTube channel called The History Guy. He's the history guy, and he talks about all this different kind of stuff. But as I've thought about it, I've thought, technically you're a historiographer because you don't have access to it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible's unique. And so I want to encourage people to treat it that way.
Yeah. Well, we only just covered a few questions, so I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about more Bible archaeology, general frequently asked questions again on another podcast. So that's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.